Um, Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. I've been concentrating quite a bit on local news and investigative centers, particularly nonprofit centers, since 2009. The Great Recession hit news in the U.S. A lot of investigative journalists were laid off or just quit because they couldn't do it anymore. And they decided, based on the inspiration of 3 other centers, that they would start their own local and regional investigative centers. So that started in 2009. There was actually, it was called INN, Investigative News Network. As we went along, we realized there were a lot of community newsrooms that had started up that were nonprofits that were doing investigative work, but not solely doing investigative work. So we kind of made the tent bigger. So anybody that was a nonprofit newsroom that was doing some investigative work could become a member. So we started with about 20, and we're over 450. I'm chair emeritus now. And we're getting lots of applications. So the number of nonprofit newsrooms and the kinds of them continue to multiply. Part of that group was inspired by something that was started here in Denmark, the Global Investigative Journalism Network. So there's actually a coalition of nonprofit newsrooms in 2003. So that was part of the inspiration for the one in the US. Having that many kinds of nonprofit newsrooms gives you lots of variety, but I've written a book, it's now a couple of years ago, where I tried to collect 15 years of knowledge and get some guiding principles and see commonalities and things that worked and things that are working. One other overall comment is that when we started this INN, this Institute for Nonprofit News, we thought it would be a bridge to the next for-profit model, since what happened in the U.S. is advertising fell out of favor, and we lost our major revenue sources. Right now, that bridge of nonprofit news is the shore, is the new shore, but I'm hoping we can find some other ways that we can generate revenue that allows us to stay really independent. One other thing I didn't put in my slideshow, but I remain very active with doing investigations, particularly local ones. I oversee something at the University of Illinois called cu-citizenaccess.org. And it concentrates on data-driven journalism and for central Illinois. So I'm kind of in the trenches with my students all the time. I'm not just tossing out theories of how things work. So let me go ahead and begin. So after 15 years or so dealing with nonprofit newsrooms, they're doing investigations, some guiding thoughts. One is, it's come to everybody that wasn't running a newsroom before, that you need diverse streams of revenue. I did run something called Investigative Reporters and Editors for years, a nonprofit association, and I had in my head that I always need 7 streams of revenue, different streams. I made it up, but it made me keep thinking, what if I lose revenue here? Where do I get some other revenue? Sometimes diverse streams of revenue in the nonprofit world just mean that you have a lot of different foundations and funders. But we like to think about things like we could actually do something that people would buy. We do training they might purchase, things like that. Diverse streams of content. You've got to not just sing the same song all the time, so you've got different kinds of content that you do, and by that I mean it could be that you could have a feed, you could have text going out, things like that, and that couples with different kinds of distribution. So you have to think, we first distributed through legacy media, so that was one way to do distribution. The problem with legacy media is the nonprofits exist because it's dying or it's dead. So you're using a distribution system that won't be there in the future. So we have to think of other ways, and I'll talk about those a little bit. Diverse partners. You need to partner with and collaborate with lots of different people, the community, other news organizations, because you need to be able to expand whatever coverage or stories you're doing. And nonprofit newsrooms, even the largest, are understaffed, like every newsroom. Diverse locations. You think about if you're in the digital world and you're on the web, your material is going to be seen by people you wouldn't expect to see it. And tracking your audience is something you need to do. I work with a group called Investigate Midwest in the middle of the country, and it turned out that all of a sudden it started to have a readership in Florida. So you've got to think you're going to be in different locations and that people may not know exactly where you are. One thing that everybody's, I think, coming to grips with is, it's a mobile device world. And I'm constantly hearing people talk about the redesign of their website and how nice their homepage looks. And that's not where anybody starts. We have to think about they're starting off a phone. They may be going to a particular web page that you didn't know was popular. But we've got to think mobile all the time, which is great because it means every story is multimedia, potentially, audio, video, and so forth. The other thing we're coming to grips with is we've gone back in time. And medieval times and before, we dealt with scrolls. And then we got books and pages. And now we're living with a scrolling society. All anybody seems to do is scroll, in particular times doom scroll. But people are reading our material, they're scrolling. So that's some other things we've been thinking about. So if you want to do news, you need to pay for it, and we've talked a lot over the years on the diverse streams of revenue and also just sources of money. And in the US, we still have advertising, but a lot of it's disappeared, and if it's digital, it doesn't pay as well. We've had wealthy owners come in. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. That's another source. We have business sponsors, which is like advertisers. You have to make sure you stay independent of those. We have the donors we know. At INN, one of our basic rules is transparency of funding. You have to tell who your large funders are, or most of your funders, because on the dark side of all this, we have dark money in the US. We've had a number of fake news sites or propaganda news sites pop up that claim that they're doing legitimate investigative work, and that's why we need to have transparency of funding. That's all over the place. One of the Republican large donors managed to grab the website watchdog.org before anyone else did. That was a failure on all our parts. And that was used to cover state houses in the US from a point of view that eventually got exposed. But they couldn't be a member of INN because the people wouldn't say where their money was coming from. We're using crowdsourcing and open source intelligence in a way to attract people and money, using things like Kickstarter for small donors. And then we're trying to be more innovative, getting funders and companies to create free open intelligence resources and free tools, which Google has done a lot of, so that we're lowering the cost. And we're going to see how much AI can lower the cost and allow us to do a lot more of the good work instead of the grunt work. Among the new ways, so there's been a huge push in the United States to revamp and support local news. We have what we call news deserts. There are 1,000 counties or more, maybe 2,000 counties and regions in the US that don't have any kind of news anymore. Nothing, no newspaper, nothing, and those are called news deserts, and we're trying to figure out how to take care of those. That's caused a lot of people to finally get concerned and support legitimate journalism. One of the things that's come out is a lot of people are talking about being closer to the community, closer to the audience. That means getting out in the community. That's like going back to the old ways. When I started way back when, I was expected to be out in neighborhoods and in the community and eating at places other people ate at. at the same coffee shops and so forth. And so there's a big move towards that. Corporate journalism in the U.S. ended up basically transferring people from town to town, and so they were in the military, and so nobody got to know anybody, and that really has created problems. We're doing more on the streaming news. One of the things is there's a tendency in local news now to really get news that people can use and use effectively. We dropped the ball on doing things on public health, like restaurant inspections. That stopped happening. People now publish the restaurant inspections and make them easy to look up and analytical, and get an incredible amount of traffic and praise for doing things that seem so basic. And then again, we found the closer you are, the more people trust you as a journalist. You get out of these discussions about the evil media and so forth. It's hard for people to do it to you if you're standing right in front of their face and you just did a story that benefited them. I wanted to show a few examples here. Outlier media is something that's really caught people's attention. It started in Detroit, Michigan, where the newspapers have really been stripped down of their resources and staff. But it started in an interesting way. It was started by an advocacy lawyer that realized that low-income people couldn't get basic information about city grants, city subsidies, any programs that would help them. And they also realized that a lot of people weren't necessarily on the web, didn't have access as easily as you might think. And so they started texting out information. About programs, about problems, issues, and they went and turned those, they eventually created a website and other kinds of things, but they've been an inspiration to a lot of people. They are a nonprofit, but they do get sponsorships and there are other streams of revenue that they go after. Has anyone heard of them at all? They've been touring, so I didn't know if they made it here.
Do you subscribe to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And then here's another one that's been very successful, Block Club Chicago. Again, some of this is revamping things that existed long ago. They used to have in Chicago, city of Chicago, block clubs that had their own newspapers. So every neighborhood had some kind of newspaper at one time. The Chicago papers, the Sun-Times and the Tribune, are just a shadow of what they were. They've gone through a lot of changes. In fact, the Chicago Sun-Times was bought by WBZ, which is Public Broadcasting System. So one of the two major for-profit papers is actually a nonprofit now. But Block Club was started by three journalists who basically said, we want to cover the neighborhoods again. And they've got an incredible amount of support, and they're out in the neighborhoods. They want their reporters to live in the neighborhoods, one of the neighborhoods they cover. They have a lot of community outreach. They're a nonprofit, but they do offer subscriptions to a couple of newsletters as a way of getting some money. And they've generated more than $1 million out of that. So people can donate, and then they can subscribe to something if they want to support them. And of course, they have foundations. They also collaborate with all these other nonprofits that have sprung up in Chicago. There must be 15 to 20 now that all are thriving in some kind of way because of the demise of the major newspapers. So they're a fun one to look at. And if you're talking about local news, they're doing it. And initially they did, oops, yeah?
Just a question.
What's that?
A question.
Yeah.
Well, these neighborhoods, how many inhabitants are they covering?
I think up to 20, full disclosure, I'm on their board, so I get the reports periodically. I think they're up to 20, maybe more now. The first hardcore coverage was 18 neighborhoods. And a neighborhood in Chicago is like a city itself, a town. So
how many people do you think is in?
Probably a million in terms of the residents, yeah. Yeah, I would say, because they're in the bigger neighborhoods, and they started in the neighborhoods that had been ignored and overlooked during the time of the Sun-Times and Tribune. Because what happened in the U.S. is the corporations got more interested in the interests of the advertisers than of the people. So if the people didn't have a lot of money, why give them coverage? So, there's a lot that led up to the collapse of the news industry. So in any case, they're a model at this point. They've been careful with their money, but they're probably up to 30 staff members now. And they're generating multiple streams of revenue: advertisers, sponsorships, donations, foundations. They also have tied into a commercial broadcast station, so they get more exposure that way. But they're a nice model to look at. Whoops, misspelled it. CoLab is in Colorado, and Laura Frank should have been here, not me today. She runs CoLab, and it's a collaborative project of, I think, dozens of newsrooms, both for-profit and non-profit. They help and bring together and supply training and support to throughout the state of Colorado. And so their real model of what's two of the words that come up all the time in the new media, the new nonprofit media, is collaboration and cooperation, and maybe a little competition. So whereas I grew up in media where it's cutthroat competition and you couldn't wait to beat somebody on any story, the words now are let's work together. It's bad enough as it is, as it's gotten. Let's multiply our resources. Here's an interesting one that began in the U.S. as a blog, Talking Points Memo, and Talking Points was one guy, and then he had a little staff, and he really concentrated on political investigations, and it's grown and grown, and he won a bunch of awards, and he has a staff, and he's a complete hybrid. He refuses to call himself a nonprofit. He is a for-profit, but he consistently asks for donations. And he is pretty transparent about how he spends the money, and at least where the money comes from when it's large amounts. But the Talking Points site is something a lot of people have looked at and thought is a pretty good model. But total hybrid. A lot of people in this room probably know about the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. That's an international model I've shown to people wanting to start nonprofits. They collaborate with everybody. They've really expanded. They are all over the world. Very much donor supported, foundation supported, and government supported. I'm going to pop through a couple of others that are also, as I say, collaboration on top of collaboration. There's the Pulitzer Center, used to be known as the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. It does a lot of environmental and climate change reporting. It does other reporting, but initially it just wanted to do more international journalism and put together a network of foreign reporters, but it's transformed itself into an investigative center that's looking at the most important global issues. However, since the U.S. is in such trouble in terms of getting good coverage, they've now expanded into, they're U.S.-based, but it's only in the last year that they've expanded into the U.S. and to help with local and regional coverage of issues. So it's a very ironical one. They were going to save the world, and now they need to save the U.S. too. Other collaborations people know about, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and has taken huge data, leaks of data, and put them into multi-country collaborations. And I use these when I'm talking to people in the US because I want them to get inspired by the idea of collaboration and what it means to work together and do successful investigations. There are other sites that have come up, and in the US, journalists who had turned up their nose at collaborating, not collaborating with people, and turned up their nose at collaborating with somebody who wasn't a journalist, now are collaborating with think tanks and special projects. There are people that are tracking the non-disclosure of government information. There's this denial of secrets that people work with. There's, of course, Greenpeace that has investigative teams now, and it's been active in the U.S., but may be wiped out by a lawsuit from a billionaire there. Greenpeace USA, not all of Greenpeace. But again, there are collaborations going on with what we always called advocacy organizations. Another one that's had reporters and teams of investigative reporters for years is the Human Rights Watch. U.S. journalists made sure to stay unaware of this for years. Now they try to get jobs there. So, how am I doing on time, Bruno?
Great.
Another 5-10 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things in preparing this and another presentation is I started to find prediction sites. Does anybody look at Reuters predictions each year for news? If you don't, it's always fun to take a look at, and you can agree or disagree, but it gets your mind moving on things. And so I like to look at the different predictions that come along, and this is from last year. What's the future of news? More important but less robust, 5 things everybody needs to know about the future of journalism. And I picked out a few of them. You've got up there, first we move from a world where media organizations were gatekeepers to a world where media still create the news agenda, platform companies control access to audiences. Somehow we need to get around that. The move to digital media generally does not generate filter bubbles. Instead, automated serendipity and incidental exposure drive people to more diverse sources. Third, journalism is often losing the battle for people's attention in some countries for the public's trust, which is why a lot of people are talking about a revamping, revising, revival of local journalism is going to bring back trust. The fourth one on this was the business models that fund news are challenged, weakening professional journalism and leaving news media more vulnerable to commercial and political pressures. They kind of missed the boat on that. If you're getting a lot of donations from foundations, we used to have advertisers, now we have foundations, so we need to make sure we're independent and don't have conflicts of interest. News is more diverse than ever, and the best journalism in many cases better than ever, taking on everyone from the most powerful politicians to the biggest private companies. And that is happening, particularly in the nonprofit world. Another one of the predictor sites I went to said on the business side, publishers continue to invest, and this is talking about for-profit, in subscription and membership, with a large majority of those surveyed saying this will be an important revenue stream ahead of both display and native advertising. Probably people have seen the chart where the New York Times revenue from subscriptions exceeded its advertising. I think it was a year and a half ago. So memberships and subscriptions. Another prediction is sustainable business models for digital news developed so far more diverse and promising, etc. But they also generally support far leaner newsrooms than those historically found in legacy media. One of the best things that happened to investigative reporting, especially locally, is you don't have to have delivery trucks, you don't have to have newspapers. That's a big amount of expenditures that we don't have, so we can be leaner. One other thing that people are not talking about enough is people who move from legacy media to new media kept saying, well, we used to cover this and we should cover this, and actually there was a lot of garbage we covered in the last 20, 30 years that we didn't need to cover anymore. It took editors and producers in the US a long time to realize that they could no longer be the first at breaking news. This went on for years. It's like if you've got, the community, people, citizens, basically texting or emailing you or texting you photos and so forth, you're aggregating breaking news. You're not being the first there. So I don't think we've gone far enough in revamping what kind of coverage we should have. I think investigative is the least hard one to change on. That definition of that's still there. But for tangential ones, explanatory journalism, I think we're still finding our way. This is a project that fell apart right after I wrote the book, and it's back. I don't know if anyone knows about this, the Future of Media project. It's at Harvard, and it's really looking at where the revenue for news is and what the largest news organizations are. Since they're not journalists, they make it more media. So the biggest distributor and so forth in their mind is Wikipedia. But they do get down to like who's getting the most money, who's the largest, and so forth. And one of the scary things is high up on the list. It's the Epoch Times. Does anyone know the Epoch Times? It's basically run by a cult, Falun Gong, that's very anti-communist, but it takes lots of ads and it's widely distributed in the U.S. And they found out that if they sided with Trump on anything Trump-like, that their ad revenue went up. So now they've become a vehicle for the Trumpster. Anyway, this sort of breaks down the sources of revenue. So you can see in this new way, you talk about diverse sources. I think this is Center for Investigative Reporting. That's diverse revenue. That's what it takes in the U.S. to have a robust investigative newsroom. So I hadn't seen somebody really add it up, which this project did. So there's some stunning things at this place. So when it comes to local news in the U.S., there has been a big new program called Press Forward. And the idea, which actually came up in 2009 when we were creating INN, was that foundations should put together pools of funds and encourage each other to give more, and those pools of funds at that time would help investigative newsrooms, new ones. This has changed to helping all local newsrooms. So the plan was to raise $1 billion and then distribute it throughout the United States to places that were doing local news but were struggling. They kicked off the program before they raised $1 billion. They only got up to $500 million, which seems like a lot, but there are a lot of needs. They also started without being clear on what the criteria would be to apply for those funds. So they like to say it's an evolving program, and some people call it mess forward, but they are getting money out into local news. But this was a big effort to create this large pool of money that could get distributed. The first grants just came out, and there were 900 applicants, organizations, news organizations, including for-profits, and they did a mix, but it turns out they were nice. They did a spreadsheet of all the people they gave money to, and when you went and added it up, 60% of the money went to for-profit newsrooms. That means to a newsroom that is using a failed business model. So some of us have been skeptical and said, okay, so they create a life support system that eventually is going to have to be ended. We felt like all the money should be going to people trying new things, and nonprofits in the U.S. are expected to reinvest in the newsroom. So it's an evolving program, but the idea of pooling money together has been around for a while. One other thing we've learned through this, particularly in local newsrooms, is that if people trust you, it will lead to support. So even the crumbling smaller for-profit newsrooms are getting donations from their own communities, so that people are not only subscribing but adding money simply because it's the only game in town and they want to support it so they can find out what's going on or tell people what they're doing. So is anybody familiar with the Trust Project? This is one of the several initiatives going on. It's ironic that other people are saying these are the standards for credible journalism, and we will go ahead and give you a badge for doing credible journalism if you meet all the criteria that we have. So the Trust Project does support a lot of people by reviewing them and say they meet certain standards. And you can see, they're the standards, they're right there. I've been involved with a couple of organizations in the U.S. that have gone through the Trust Project review, which can really take a lot of time, but it does help with people trusting you, and particularly with raising money if you do it. So that's why people are doing it. And It's both for-profit and nonprofit. I don't know how many organizations they're up to now, but you can see the mix up there. And it is every kind of newsroom wants some kind of special stamp of approval, and this is only one of them. The Institute for Nonprofit News actually has a bunch of standards that we make public, and that an applicant has to meet those standards, and those standards are transparency and independence, and it's outlined. So that's yet another stamp of approval. So we're trying to create sites that can be trusted, but in the end, I think local news, and especially local investigative news, has the best chance of being trusted because you're on site, people can see you, you're living in the community, they know you, and they can tell you right away if you're wrong. That was one of the joys for me of doing local news. You're a hero one day and a villain the next day, and that's just the process. But it means they're seeing what you're doing, and they're responding, and you're learning. So that's pretty much the overview.
Okay, thank you, Brant.
Okay.
Questions?
Any questions?
Questions?
Thoughts?
Oh, okay, we'll take a...
Wait a minute, I was having a class here. My class is don't talk. I told one class that I figured out if I did a video of myself when I'm teaching and I put it next to me, then you could watch me on video and I could comment, and they thought that was a good idea. So, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, of course, you are also very much involved in the Global Investigative Journalism Network, and they have, and other organizations as well, fantastic homepages with a lot of information, a lot of methods, and so forth. What would you say is the most important thing for a national or a local investigative center to do, not to compete with all the resources that are already there online internationally?
I think it comes down to proving or showing that people are paying attention to what you're doing and that you're paying attention to their response. One of the things I've dealt with over the years in fundraising is somebody will say, well, they're going to get all the money. Most foundations like to have a portfolio. Is a program officer in here, or somebody who's been a program officer? Anyway, program officers will tell you it's like having a hand of cards. You don't want one card, you want to have a portfolio. So yes, you end up competing for money, but a lot of times if you're doing something particularly valuable, and right now I think local, you're not going to compete so much in money or content. So it's just a matter of being clearly different, and a different but a real value. I think that's kind of how it goes. A lot of people just don't realize, there's nothing like sitting down with somebody who's been a program officer at a foundation to understand how that works. And, they want to succeed. Yes?
It sounds like that you're telling us that investigative journalism is more dependent on foundations now.
In the U.S., yeah.
Yeah, but also in Denmark. So what is your take on the fact that it's now foundations directing investigative journalism and not?
Well, I think that's the key. And when I went to IRE, to a nonprofit association, a friend of mine who'd already been in nonprofits said, you know what, you used to have advertisers, now you have foundations. And what he was saying is you're going to have to make sure that you have firewalls and independence and are not steered by the money, that you have the ability to say no when you shouldn't. Otherwise, you have mission drift and you're just chasing money. So for me, the way to get through that is to find where things that you're doing is a good match for that foundation. There's one good thing is that journalists report on journalists. So if it's clear a foundation is clearly telling a newsroom what to do, that gets exposed. So they're already, it's a tradition of this. But yeah, you're always, as a journalist, you're always figuring out where the money's really coming from and how you maintain your independence whether it's an advertiser, sponsor, or foundation. Yeah.
I mean, we are also increasingly concerned in Europe about pluralism in media, and the countries are as well.
Mm-hmm.
So public funding for media has become much more available.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a danger in this dependency on public money?
Yeah, I see a danger everywhere, just like we talked about foundations, and that's one of the reasons you want to have diverse streams of revenue. Because if either that stream gets cut off, or you need to cut it off, you need to find something else. So we have to be vigilant. The U.S. journalists, I got lectured all the time about, we'll never take government money in the U.S. And journalists are terrible on reporting on journalism most of the time. I said, let's see, you're subsidized by the post office if you send anything that's journalistic. So that's a discount. Laws have been passed so that legal ads like bids and purchases have to be put into newspapers, which they pay for. And we have public broadcasting. So again, you're always thinking ahead. If the government changes or you cut off from that money, or suddenly you get more pressure. But there's been public funding of journalism for a long time. It's just, what are the rules of the road? Yeah, it's always a struggle, so, you know.
Okay, thank you, and there will be a 10 minutes break, so we will be back here 5 minutes to 2.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you.